Thank you everyone for being here. Today I would like to talk to you about the first chapter of my dissertation, which is a review of oyster restoration projects in the Atlantic and the Gulf Coast of the US. So for a bit of background, for centuries humans have been driven to coastal systems. We obtain a great number of ecosystem services from them. We rely on them for food, for employment, for recreation, and as a place to live. But human activity has been so intensive that to this day, no pristine coastal areas remain. If you look at this map, you can see the world's oceans highlighted in different colors. And you'll notice that the areas around the coast are either orange or red, indicating that they have had a medium high to a very high human impact. And this means that ecosystems such as mangrove forests, seagrass meadows, and coral reefs are severely degraded due to human activities. And although it is difficult to find pristine areas in the coast, out of all the imperiled coastal systems, one of the most threatened is probably oyster reefs. If you look at this map, you'll see that you'll see the oyster beds around the world highlighted in different colors, and you'll see that most of them are in poor condition or functionally extinct. And in fact, oyster degradation has been so intense that to this day we've lost 85% of the oyster reefs worldwide. And this rapid loss of oysters is concerning because humans and oysters have a long and important history. Oysters have incredible social and cultural value. They have permeated our cultures, become part of our traditions or local cuisines. In addition, oyster reefs hold incredible economic value. This single species once supported a historically productive industry that even to this day continues to bring in hundreds of millions of dollars in US landings. And oyster reefs and the fisheries that these oyster reefs support provide employment for approximately 30,000 people in the US. On top of that, oyster reefs provide valuable ecosystem services. Oysters settle on top of other oysters, and by doing this, they create complex three-dimensional structures that are large and solid, so that when waves hit them, they actually diminish the energy these waves hold, so that once that water reaches the shoreline, it is not as forceful as it could have been, and this protects our shores and reduces erosion. In addition, this complex three-dimensional structure is filled with little cracks and crevices that serve as refuge for juvenile fish, thus enabling oyster reefs to serve as nursery grounds. And also, these little spaces provide habitat for other invertebrates and other small species that can settle there and be protected from predators. And thus, they create this very diverse community. In addition, oysters are filter feeders. That means they can remove particles from the water, increasing water clarity and water quality. And so now we see the value that oysters hold, but oysters are subject to a wide variety of threats. And some of them are naturally occurring, such as disease. Oyster reefs have been destroyed by two particular protist parasites called Perkinus marinus and Haplosperidum nelsoni that are able to infect entire reefs until they completely destroyed it. And also in areas where storms are common, hurricanes, for example, can dislodge or bury entire reefs. And then in areas where there isn't enough of a freshwater refuge, predators can move in. Predators such as oyster drills and conchs and crabs can move in and decimate entire reefs. Then in addition, there's anthropogenic threats. The most prominent probably is over-harvesting. So for centuries, we have been removing oysters from oyster beds to consume them, to sell them. However, as technology advances, we've come up with more intensive and more destructive methods to remove oysters. One such example is dredging, which is essentially a rake-like structure that is dragged across the ground, ripping up everything that it encounters. And in doing so, it lifts entire reefs from the ground, completely eliminating that hard, solid structure that other oyster larvae need in order to continue to grow. And then another anthropogenic impact is sedimentation and nutrient pollution. And this is where we are increasing the turbidity of the water faster than the oysters can clear it up. And we're creating we're burying the reefs in sediments, or we're creating anoxic conditions that suffocate oysters. And then finally, people love to live around coastal areas, and we've developed the coast so intensively that we've removed the habitat or the places where oyster reefs could potentially grow. So the next question is naturally, what have we been doing to fix this? We clearly depend on oysters and we want them, but they're so threatened. Well, it depends on what species of oyster you're looking at, because different species have different approaches. And one such example is the Olympia oyster, Australurida, in Washington State, where in efforts to recover this, they have been growing oyster larvae in tanks, having them settle on oyster shells, and then transplanting those oyster shells into areas where they know that historic reefs once occurred. In contrast, in the UK, there is the European oyster, Ostra edilis, that hasn't had any actual restoration project, but there have been feasibility studies to determine whether or not restoration is possible. And a third example is the Wadden Sea in Western Europe that has depleted oyster beds, and so to make up for this, they have introduced the Pacific oyster, Chrysostra gigas, into these oyster beds. However, no other oyster species has been the target of more restoration than the eastern oyster, Chrysostra virginica. This is a species with a very broad range. It extends from Canada to Brazil and Argentina. However, the bulk of restoration efforts are concentrated in that small area, in the Atlantic and the Gulf Coast of the US. So this is a tropical species, or a species that can occur in the tropics, but there has been little to no effort in these areas outside this red square. In fact, I think there are less than 10 scientific publications that deal with restoration projects outside of that area. And so the bulk of restoration efforts of Chrysostra virginica extend from Maine to the coast of Texas. So what does restoration look like? Restoration of oyster reefs hinges upon the idea that reefs need a hard substrate on which to settle. Oysters are used to settling on top of other oysters, and so restoration projects try to provide this hard substrate so that reefs can begin to grow. And there are many different methods. There's reef balls, shellbacks, oyster mats, many methods and techniques just to bring this one species back. And so we've been doing this for nearly 25 years. And so what have we learned so far? Well, this is a difficult question to answer because to date, there has been no comprehensive synthesis of the restoration efforts we've conducted thus far. And so that is why we set out to compile a database of all the oyster reef restoration projects we could find. And I wanted this to be my first chapter because I wanted to understand what the extent of oyster restoration had been, learn what the different methods and techniques were out there, and most importantly, to identify the gaps in knowledge so that I could better guide the rest of my chapters in a way that I can significantly contribute to this field. And so, while compiling the database, we searched the scientific literature. Specifically, we did a Web of Science search with the keywords oyster and restoration. We looked at public databases of restoration projects. Two of the main ones were the NOAA Restoration Atlas and the Nature Conservancy database of coastal projects. And then we contacted restoration practitioners across different regions and different agencies. So eventually, all the projects that made it into this database had to meet certain criteria. First, they had to be focused on the eastern oyster. The restoration project had to be completed or already underway. And the study and the restoration projects needed to have a clear geographic location. And so, having compiled this database, we sought to answer 3 research questions. The first one being, how has restoration effort varied across regions and over time? How have restoration materials varied across regions and over time? And how does the restoration cost per unit area vary across regions and depending on the materials that you use? And as we saw before, the bulk of the restoration efforts was concentrated in this area. So we identified 957 projects from Maine to Texas. But because conditions vary from region to region, we further subdivided this into 5 different subregions following NOAA's classification scheme. So we separated it into the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, Chesapeake Bay, the Southeast, and the Gulf Coast. So the first question we addressed was, how has restoration effort varied over time and across regions? So to do this, we went to our database, counted the total number of projects in each region, and then looked at the projects that had the amount of area that they had restored, and added it all across all sites and for each individual region. And then we graphed both of these things over time. And then finally, we wanted to know what the average size of each project was. So we looked at mean project size overall and across regions. And so first, looking at the number of restoration projects, we see that starting in 1992, all the way up to 2015, there have been 957 projects. But when you break it up by regions, you see that the Chesapeake Bay has the earliest and most intensive efforts, but that in recent years, these efforts have begun to taper off. And that's when the Southeast and the Gulf Coast come in. Their efforts ramp up later than the Chesapeake's, but in later years, you can see that they are still on the rise. And finally, you have the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, which have been lagging behind with relatively few restoration projects. And so why do we see these trends? Well, Chesapeake Bay is the clear frontrunner in restoration. It has the earliest and most intensive efforts with over 1,000 projects and accounting for 79% of the total. And this is probably due to the hugely productive industry that Chesapeake Bay supported. And so the early efforts were geared more for economic reasons of restoration practitioners wishing to recover those historically productive oyster grounds. But then we have the Southeast with a lot fewer projects than the Chesapeake, but it's still the second region with the most projects. So it accounts for 10% of the total. And if you recall, its efforts ramp up relatively later than the Chesapeake. And this is probably due to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, which destined billions of dollars into scientific research, some of which went into restoration and some of which reached oyster restoration projects. And an important thing to notice between the Chesapeake and the Southeast is that whereas the earliest efforts of the Chesapeake were focused on economic reasons, efforts in the Southeast were more geared towards ecosystem services. And then the region with the third most projects was the Gulf Coast, with 8% of the total projects. And although it seems that it's a little, efforts start a little later, restoration projects are expected to increase as a result of the Restore Act in 2012. So this is the act that is in charge of distributing the funds from the Deepwater Horizons bill. And so these are billions of dollars that will go into projects that are, whose goal is to restore and protect the Gulf Coast. So while not all of these funds will go to oyster restoration projects, some of it will. And then there's the Mid-Atlantic, where it only accounts for 2% of the projects, but it's still interesting to know why there has been such little restoration. And the problem in the Mid-Atlantic is that the water quality is so bad that government agencies, such as the Department of Environmental Protection, is actually concerned that restoring oyster reefs will cause what they call an attractive nuisance. Essentially, they're concerned that poachers will go to restored reefs, collect those oysters, and then sell them, and these will eventually reach humans and make them ill. But this doesn't mean that restoration projects are completely stifled. So there is one project called the Billion Oyster Project, which, as its name states, has the goal of planting 1 billion oysters in New York Harbor. And so they work with middle school students and volunteers to plant, to harvest, to grow oysters and plant them out in New York Harbor, and then monitor their growth and long-term success. And finally, there is the Northeast with 1% of the projects. And here it's also interesting to know why there has been such a lack of effort. So the problem in the Northeast is recruitment. They have lower episodic recruitment, meaning that it doesn't matter whether they put out restoration structures, there's not enough oyster larvae to actually make a reef grow. So they rely on oyster farming and growing oysters or growing spat and then transplanting them into reefs. But then there's also high uncertainty of where these historic oyster reefs are. So typically, restoration projects try to restore areas where they know oyster reefs existed. But in the Northeast, there isn't that clear knowledge. So restoration practitioners have a difficult time even just choosing where they're going to restore. Okay, so that was one way to look at restoration effort. We also looked at the total area of constructed reef. So looking at how big is the aerial footprint that we have restored. And so across with the total projects, you have approximately 1,500 hectares of constructed reef. But again, when you break it down by regions, you see similar trends, with the Chesapeake having the most intensive efforts, followed by the Southeast and the Gulf Coast, and then lagging behind the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast. And so the numbers here represent the number of hectares each region has restored. But I think it's a worthwhile exercise to picture how big a hectare is. So how big is a hectare? Well, if you look at American football, one American football field is approximately half a hectare. If you're more of a soccer fan, one soccer field equals 0.8 hectares. And so with that picture in mind, you can picture just how big these aerial footprints are. So in total, these restoration projects have constructed 1,447 hectares, or almost 3,000 football fields worth of reef. And finally, we wanted to look at what the mean area of these projects was. So if you look at the average area of all projects, you see that it's between 2 and 2.5 hectares. But then you look at the Chesapeake, and it has the largest mean area per project. And this is probably due to restoration efforts that have been going on in Maryland and Virginia since 2003, in which they restore on a very large scale on multiple sites across Virginia and Maryland. And this has been going on for years. So I think that's what is reflected here in this graph. And then another interesting thing to note is that the Southeast has the lowest mean area of projects, with only about averaging about half a hectare per project. But it's interesting because if you recall, the Southeast is the region with the second most restoration effort. So what this is saying is that the Southeast is restoring a lot, but on a smaller spatial scale. And so with that, we move to the second question, which is, how have restoration materials varied over time and across regions? So to do this, we again went to our database and looked at the details of restoration and identified the materials that were used. And we classified this into one of 4 categories, and then compared number of projects, the total area of constructed reef, the mean project size for each of these categories. So over the years, we've relied on different restoration substrates. We've used oyster shell, concrete, a mixture of oyster shell and concrete, and other substrates such as surf clam shell or whelk shell, or even limestone and granite boulders. But if you look at the percentage of projects that use each of these substrates, you see that oyster has been the historically popular approach. And but we also wanted to know how restoration materials varied across regions. So if you see this pie chart, this is exactly the same as I showed a couple slides ago, where you see oyster shown in the blue with 72% of projects, concrete and gray with 9%, mixed substrate with green at 14%, and other substrates in purple with 4%. So when you look at every region, you see that this pattern holds across the board. And in every region except for the Northeast, you see oyster shell is the preferred substrate. And it is most striking in the Chesapeake Bay, where it accounts for 82% of all projects. And you see that all the other substrates remained relatively unexplored. And the reason for using oyster shell is, there are several reasons. One of them is because it's a historic approach. So before it was called restoration, people in the oyster industry would call it reef maintenance and dump their loose oyster shell to make up for the habitat they had destroyed. But then also, the rationale behind it is that oyster shells mimic the natural habitat. And as you remember, oysters like to settle with other oysters. So oyster shell was the natural approach. And furthermore, later studies found that oysters respond to chemical cues by other oysters, so further supporting the choice of oyster as a restoration substrate. However, mixed substrates are used whenever oyster shell is scarce, and so you would use concrete because it provides a hard substrate, but then mix it with oyster shell so that you still have that complexity and that mimicking of natural habitat. And then concrete structures are relatively unexplored, but they are used in areas where, for example, where high energy buries or dislodges oyster shells, so you need a more durable structure that can withstand higher environmental stress. So if you look at the area constructed over time, and you break it down by regions, you see that oyster substrates account for the bulk of it, account for approximately 85%. And mixed other and concrete substrates are lagging behind. And this number here, again, shows the number of hectares that were constructed using each of the substrates. Then, when you look at the mean project size, you see that total projects are almost at 2 hectares, but oyster projects are the ones that are restoring on larger scales. And this is probably linked to those large-scale restoration efforts in Virginia and Maryland, which all typically use oyster shell. And you see concrete is the material with the smallest mean project size. And this is probably due to logistics and costs and the difficulties of constructing concrete structures and then transporting them out to sea or to the estuary. So our third question was, how have restoration costs varied over time and across regions? And for this, we relied on NOAA's Restoration Atlas. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, this is a great database that collects all of the information of all the restoration projects that are funded by NOAA. And it holds thousands and thousands of projects. However, it does not break them down by species. You can break it down by state, but you can't break it down by species. So what we did was go through each and every single one of these projects and identifying those that dealt with oyster reef restoration. And since this was our only source that consistently reported data on the funds awarded to this project, for this particular question, we only used projects that were listed here. So for those projects, we looked at how much funds were awarded, the size of the constructed reef, the materials they had used, and the region in which they were located. Then we compared the cost per unit area for each material in each region, and then the relationship between the funds awarded and the total area of constructed reef. However, it is important to note before looking at these results that the Restoration Atlas does not break down the costs. It simply gives you one number, and that is the total funds that were allotted to this project. And it does not break down how much money was used for the actual materials and how much money was used for labor costs, for planning, for transportation. So it's important to keep those caveats in mind when looking at the results. So the first thing we analyzed was the cost per hectare divided by projects and by regions. So here we have 4 graphs. Each one deals with one substrate type. So we have oyster, concrete, mixed, and other. And in the x-axis, we have our 5 regions and the total size. So the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, Chesapeake Bay, the Southeast, and the Gulf Coast, and then all sites. And what stands out immediately is that concrete is by far the most expensive substrate. But another thing that also pops out is that different regions have different materials which would be most cost effective. So for example, oyster substrates are more cost efficient in the Gulf Coast than mixed substrates are. And then, for example, the Southeast oyster substrates are less cost efficient than mixed. And so it makes you think that depending on which region you're wishing to restore, you might look at this to select what might be the best material to use. Another thing to keep in mind is that not all of these regions have been restoring for the same amount of time. So there's also something to be said about cost efficiency in terms of how long have people been doing this. So Chesapeake Bay has the longest, like earliest efforts. They've been doing this for a long time, and the longer you do something, the better you are at it. So they have more lessons learned than regions that might just be starting. And then the second way we analyzed restoration costs was by looking at the funds awarded and then how big of a reef each project was able to construct. Now, again, because the NOAA Restoration Atlas does not give you detailed budgets, we should interpret this with some caution, but it's still interesting to see how each project compares. So again, we have 4 graphs divided by substrate, and each of the points represents one restoration project. And each project is color-coded by region. So what you can see here is how different projects have used their funds and how cost-efficient they have been. So you have projects like this particular one in the Mid-Atlantic that restored almost 7 hectares with less than $100,000. But then you have a project here in the Southeast that used concrete and restored less than a hectare, even though it was awarded over $300,000. And all of these costs or funds awarded are standardized to US 2016 dollars. So now that we know this, it is important to also think about how much we have left to go. So this shows us, or this database, you're able to look at how much area have you constructed. But it's also important to think about how much oyster reef area was there originally. And for that, we looked at another study that essentially characterized the historic oyster beds and gave an approximate area of how much oyster reef there was before we severely depleted them. And so we compared the historic area to the area that we have constructed for these restoration projects. And what we found is that in the Mid-Atlantic, the area constructed accounts for less than 0.02% of what there was originally. And in Chesapeake Bay, it's less than 0.17%. And in the Gulf Coast, it's less than 0.09%. We didn't have reliable data for the Southeast and the Northeast, so these are excluded. But this just goes to show how much more there is left to do and how we need to restore on a larger spatial scale if we're ever going to reach those historic reef numbers. Well, and then going back to the restoration projects themselves, another question that we should ask is, well, how successful have these projects been? And this is a very difficult question because it's very difficult to compare one project to another. Projects have different goals, which means they monitor different variables at different frequencies and for different lengths of time. There's also no itemized budgets that allow you to compare direct costs. And I've learned from compiling this database, it is really hard to get your hands on data of all the projects that are out there. And so in the future, to evaluate restoration success, we need first a standardized monitoring protocol, which means that all projects will measure the same variables in the same way for the same interval and for the same amount of time. Then we need detailed cost reporting, and this just means showing exactly how the funds were spent so that you're able to compare every item on each project. And then finally, we need open access databases where restoration practitioners or scientists or anyone doing restoration can enter their data, and anyone interested can access it and make their own comparisons and analyses. However, this is not something that's completely unachievable. In fact, some efforts are already underway, and it's important to acknowledge them. For example, the Nature Conservancy put forth an oyster monitor and assessment handbook in 2014. And this handbook outlines the baseline data that you need to collect from reefs. So that's your point of comparison. It emphasizes the importance of having a natural control reef to which you can compare your constructed reef, something that most projects lack. it explains sampling techniques. So if different projects are monitoring the same variables, they should be using the same method. And then it lists suggested universal oyster reef metrics that should be collected and monitored, and environmental variables that should also be tied in that monitoring process. And then also proposes an appropriate amount of time for you to be monitoring that reef. So currently, a lot of the projects I found ran for 2 years or maybe 3 years. So it's very difficult to evaluate the long-term success, and that's what the Nature Conservancy is addressing by proposing this time frame for post-restoration monitoring. And so, what does the future of restoration look like? Well, we need new methods and techniques that are able to restore on a large spatial scale. If we're ever going to even come close to restoring that historic area, we need to be restoring on a larger scale than we are now. But we also, for this, we need new materials that are cheap, that can be mass produced and that can be easily deployed, that can jumpstart a reef fairly quickly so that we can restore on a scale similar to what the historic area was. So this is where I am with my project, which I hope future chapters will deal with evaluating different restoration techniques to both recover oysters, but also optimize the ecosystem services that we obtain from them, and also to design structures that can optimize oyster settlement and growth, and essentially create the diverse community that oyster reefs can hold. And also, even though, like, as I said, the eastern oyster has a very wide range, and restoration efforts are lacking in Latin America. But despite this, I think that with this knowledge and the insights that we gain from reviewing the restoration projects in the US, we gain important insights that whenever we do go out and restore in Latin America, we are going to use the most effective and most cost-efficient approach. And so with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention. And I would like to thank the University of Florida, the Neuroscience Collaborative, and of course the TCD program for funding my research. And if time allows, I am happy to take questions.